The FBI, honestly, has a really big mess on its hands. So maybe it is good that the FBI is about to get somebody new in charge for the first time in 12 years. The mess right now is about the Boston bombing. And the FBI's mess here is not just about the bombing itself. It's not just that they apparently closed their file on one of the two suspected bombers and then lost track of him before the bombing. The mess for the FBI here is also now about this. This is another young Chechen man who is reportedly not linked himself to the bombing or to radical ideology of any kind. But he did know the older of the two Boston bombing suspects when he lived for a time and practiced mixed martial arts at the same gym as one of the suspects in Boston. After the Boston bombing, this young man, Ibrahim Todashev, he was questioned in Florida multiple times about the bombing itself and about his ties to the bombing suspect. But last week, while he was being questioned again in Florida, something went very, very wrong, and he ended up dead. Law enforcement, including FBI agents, were questioning him in his home in Orlando last Wednesday when something happened. And this 27-year-old who was being questioned, this Ibrahim Todashev, he ended up dead. Well, today in Moscow, that man's family held a press conference at which the dead man's father held up and distributed photos. I have to give you a warning that these images are a little bit graphic. He distributed photos that he said were taken of his son's body after it was autopsied. We are being told that the autopsy report is not likely to be released for months because of this ongoing investigation, but we now have these photos because the body was released from the morgue to the next of kin in Florida, and his son's friend, the young man who you see here, who is also Russian, who was also questioned by the FBI, he says he took these photos of his friend's body, and he gave those photos to the guy's family in Russia. And that led to today's press conference in Moscow, with the family showing these photos and demanding answers for what happened to their son. Now, we have not been able to authenticate these photos. Nobody has. And the medical examiner today did not confirm to us by the time we went to air that these photos are actually of this guy and that these are real photos. But if these photos, and again, these are graphic images, if these photos are him, if these are his post-autopsy photos, if these are him and they are real, then something weird is going on. Because they appear to show that he was shot 6 times in the torso and once in the back of the head. The rear of his head, sort of at the crown of his head. How does that comport with the FBI's story that he was killed during questioning by armed agents who were only acting in self-defense? Shot 7 times, including in the back of the head? After the Boston bombings and the killing of the older of the two suspects in the Boston bombings and the capture of the younger one, after that happened, the one real mystery that emerged in conjunction with this case was about another crime, a crime that happened in 2011. On the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, September 11th, 2011, a quiet neighborhood in greater Boston that's called Waltham suffered a really horrific and really atypical crime. 3 young men in Waltham, all fit, strong young men, they were all found in a Waltham apartment with their throats slit. Their bodies were covered in marijuana. It had been thrown all over the bodies. And $5,000 in cash was left untouched at the scene. After Tamerlan Tsarnaev was implicated in the Boston bombing, that cold case triple murder from 2011 in Waltham, that cold case got hot again when investigators realized that this guy, the bombing suspect, had been very close friends with one of the young men who was killed that night in Waltham. People who knew the victims also told local reporters that they'd always thought it was strange that Tamerlan Tsarnaev didn't attend the funeral of his murdered friend. They thought it was strange that he didn't go since they were so close. Could the Boston bombing suspect have been the perpetrator of that unsolved triple murder as well as the Boston bombing? Was it just a coincidence that he was a link between these two crimes, or were they connected because he did both of them? That was the remaining mystery, right? After the Boston bombing suspects, one of them was killed and one of them was arrested. That was the remaining mystery. And then, after this other young man was killed last week in Florida during questioning by the FBI, unnamed law enforcement sources started leaking an elaborate story that not only made it seem justified for him to have been killed during questioning, but also, drum roll please, it was an elaborate story that basically solved that unsolved triple murder in Waltham. Two unnamed law enforcement officials saying the dead man had implicated himself and Tamerlan Tsarnaev in the Waltham murder right before he was fatally shot during questioning. Quote, he appeared to be on the verge of signing a confession to those murders. He was about to confess. Sources say that Todashev snapped as investigators pushed him toward a confession. He lunged at the interrogator with a blade. Or maybe it was a knife. He lunged at an FBI agent with a knife. So that was the story that we heard. That's how we learned that the FBI had been questioning this guy in Florida and that they had killed him during questioning. That is the story that we were told when we learned that he existed, that they were questioning him, and that he was now dead. But since then, in the week since, starting even before the family showed these photos today, saying he was shot in the back of the head and 6 other times, since the initial story of what happened in Orlando when this guy died first came out, that initial story has fallen apart. Within 12 hours of the initial reports, 2 of the initial 3 law enforcement sources who had described the dead man as having a knife said they were no longer sure about the knife. So what was 3 sources is now 1 source. Then yesterday, WESH in Orlando and the Washington Post both cited multiple law enforcement sources saying, in fact, the young man was unarmed. Then yesterday, law enforcement sources said he might have been lunging for a sword that was in the room where he was being questioned, and that he pushed a table and possibly threw a chair. Now, tonight, NBC News was told by the FBI that the young man was not unarmed, but he didn't have a knife either. He had a metal rod of some kind. And the law enforcement officers shot him because they thought he was reaching for a gun from somewhere. And so they shot him 7 times, including in the back of the head. We do not know precisely that is the number of times he was shot, but that is what the family is saying based on photos they say were taken of his body post-autopsy. No one will confirm that or deny that officially, whether that is the actual nature of his wounds. And through all of this serial, unnamed source leaking, including not just generic law enforcement sources, but also FBI sources specifically, through all of this, the FBI's stance here has been privately multiple contradictory but always self-exculpatory leaks. And officially, publicly, their stance has been basically silence. Ongoing investigation. We've sent a review team. There will be no further official comment. And meanwhile, the family in Russia is holding a press conference, distributing what they say are the death photos, demanding justice, saying that no one from the U.S. has contacted them at all since the killing. They say they have no explanation, and so they are seeking an explanation by media circus. And in Orlando, yesterday, the widow and the family and friends are holding a press conference saying they, too, do not understand. They have no information officially. And honestly, if you look at their comments, both at the press conference and their other remarks they have made since this happened, they're all now drifting into conspiracy land, in which they think the FBI is the American version of the secret police back home, and this must mean there's some bloody conspiracy of American law enforcement to wage unjust war on the Chechen people, just like they do at home in Mother Russia, which is ridiculous. But until we hear some real information from law enforcement about what actually happened here, instead of this mess that they're giving us, of sometimes false, always anonymous, usually inflammatory, unofficial leaks, with that being the only side of the story we're getting from law enforcement, what we're left with here is a baffling mess and a story that does not make sense. And a million questions, not only about what happened last week in that apartment in Orlando, but what happened in that triple murder in Waltham. And are we any closer now to solving it? Joining us now is Michael Rezendes. He's an investigative reporter for the Boston Globe. He's been reporting on the murders in Waltham since they took place in 2011. Mr. Rezendes, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I appreciate having you here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
What is the status, as you understand it, of the investigation into the Waltham murders? Again, we have no official word on what the status is, but as far as you understand it, are we any closer to knowing what happened there?
Officially, I don't know that we're any closer. It would seem that we're closer because we have a suspect that's been named, at least off the record. But the status of the investigation is ongoing, and there are as many questions about Waltham as there are about Orlando. There are lots of missing pieces, and in many ways, the stories that are told and circulated simply don't add up for a variety of reasons. So it remains a mystery with coincidence after coincidence after coincidence that lead people to suspect that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was one of the killers, and perhaps now Ibrahim Todashev was the other.
In terms of the sort of unofficial naming of at least Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the Boston bombing suspect, as again, unofficially a suspect in the crime. Do you know from your reporting on this over the years, do we know if police in Massachusetts ever questioned him or interviewed him in conjunction with that murder? Did his name ever come up in conjunction with the crime?
Well, we don't know whether he was ever interviewed, and it's probably the most important question to have answered right now if one wants to assess the job that the police did at the time. Even that basic fact, we don't know. Now, the day after these three gentlemen were murdered, the district attorney said that there were essentially, he said there were two suspects. He said there were two people who were in the apartment just before the triple homicide took place. And he promised that there would be more information, and there was never any more information. But he did say at the time that there were two, and now we do have two names that are being circulated as suspects, and I think surely that they are suspects. Whether they did it or not is another question.
Well, when you heard about the shooting in Orlando and the subsequent statements, again, all unofficial, from law enforcement that this man was on the verge of confessing in writing to the Waltham murders and that he had implicated Tamerlan Tsarnaev, did that, as somebody who's been covering this, did that development make sense to you, given your previous reporting on Waltham? Did it seem like that things are going that direction?
Well, I had a couple of reactions to it, but I guess the first reaction is that someone like Ibrahim Todichev as a suspect does make some sense, because one of the mysteries about the Waltham triple homicide is that two of the three gentlemen who were murdered were experts in the martial arts. They were very fit, they were very strong, and it would have taken some expert fighters to be able to overpower them without a single shot being fired and then to kill them. So if you talk about Tamerlan, he was a very accomplished amateur boxer, also a mixed martial arts fighter, and you have Ibrahim Todichev as also an accomplished mixed martial arts fighter. Suddenly it begins to make some sense.
Michael, can I just ask you, in reporting on Waltham, I mean, trying to get something out of the Middlesex County DA on this is like trying to crack a safe. Like, there's no official information at all, and there never really has been. In your reporting on this, have you had to deal with the same kind of unnamed law enforcement leaks of contradictory information that we're seeing coming out of this case in the Orlando part of it? And how do you handle that when that is the way that law enforcement is sort of refusing to talk about these stories?
Well, it's very, very frustrating and very, very difficult. And I think part of what's going on here is that there are a lot of reporters dealing with a lot of law enforcement sources. And the thing about law enforcement sources is they're people, and they're like everyone else, which is to say they gossip and they speculate and they kibitz. And not all of them have access to accurate information, obviously. So when you're dealing with a story like this, it's very important to assess the information that comes your way and to try to figure out where it's coming from and to assess the track record of the person that's giving you the information. And it can be frustrating and time-consuming, but it is very important to get it right.
In this case, watching this case run away from the FBI and from American law enforcement, even now in an international context with this press conference, this unbelievable press conference with the death photos in Moscow, makes clear to me that there ought to be some more official information on the record, but we shall see.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, Michael Resendiz, investigative reporter for the Boston Globe, thanks for helping us understand this. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
All right. So how are your summer plans shaping up thus far? Are you thinking about maybe spending some time interrogating your political opponents with the same inane questions that lead nowhere for months at a time? Turns out somebody's already beat you to that particular plan, and that's coming up. Stay with us.